Hello, class, and welcome to week 8 and our summary of week 7. We are now into the back half of our class, and I'm sure for many of you, y'all are very excited about that. And for those of you who just completed a 7-week course, congratulations on being complete with that also. And hopefully, y'all have a week off or so you can just kind of take a little bit of a break. Again, we will have a break later on in the semester, but this class is up and going. So we're going to jump in. We're actually going to spend a little bit more time this week kind of talking about a few aspects in the Ivy text, which I know we don't traditionally do, but I think you guys are getting a really good hand on some of what the Clinton text is having to say, especially in regards to what we had in our discussion board this week. So we won't spend a lot of time talking about what was on the discussion board this week. Instead, we'll spend some time in the Ivy text. And so I know that the first concept we're going to talk about is self-disclosure as a therapist or as a counselor in the session with your client. And I know that that subject is not directly brought out a lot in the Ivy text, but I feel like it's one that's very appropriate, especially as y'all are into your counseling enactments, and I'm sure learning as you go, and what is appropriate self-disclosure as you are the counselor, which is of course different when you're the actual client. So we're going to talk about a couple different guidelines for self-disclosure. The first of it being is kind of, when do you use self-disclosure? What is self-disclosure? So self-disclosure essentially is when you as the therapist are sharing something from your personal life with the intent of aiding in the session, to maybe bring the client to a new place of recognition, to maybe encourage them, maybe level the playing field. But self-disclosure is using something from your life in order to share with the client in hopes that it's going to be very impactful in the session. So when we talk about self-disclosure and when we would use it in the session, the biggest thing that you need to take into consideration is it going to be helpful to the client? Now, of course, you cannot know all of the outcomes of what's going to happen or how a client is going to react when you use your story in a session. But a couple things that you can do to kind of check is to go, what is my motivation for sharing this? Is this an issue that I've already worked through? The goal of self-disclosure is not to share something in hopes of ourselves processing through it. So for instance, if let's say you're working through a traumatic situation yourself, that's probably not an area that you would want to bring up in a session as you're going through it, because the purpose of that might be, in a backhanded way, to help you process through it rather than maintaining the goal that your client is the one who's actually there for counseling at that point. So again, you're going to want to be asking that question is it going to be helpful? What I'm going to share, is it going to be helpful to the client? Also, if I were to share this, does it shift the focus of the session away from the client and onto you or to your experience? That would be something that you would want to just be keeping in check. I know that there's been times where in good faith I have shared something about myself, and it's been well received by the client, but they've kind of taken that and run with that and wanted to ask more questions. It's my job then as a therapist to make sure that I redirect that conversation back to the client and let them know, hey, here's why I'm sharing this. There have been a couple times where I've offered disclosure of myself, and a client has asked a question, and I have felt very comfortable answering that question because it was directly related to what we are talking about in regards to them. So it's something that more or less you just need to be aware of and kind of checking yourself to go, why exactly am I sharing this? And a really good indicator of that is your gut. What does your gut tell you? Kind of check your gut. Ask yourself that question. Why do you want the client to know this story? What is important for the client to know out of this story? So again, self-disclosure can be used in a very positive way, where your client really gets the point. And then there can be other times where even in good faith, you can use an element of disclosure and it just goes completely awry. So I figured I would use a couple examples from my own life. So this is self-disclosure, but again, it's for the purpose of these examples. So self-disclosure for good. Okay, so I have several girls or young women that I work with, probably in that 20 to 30-year-old range, who are either single or coming out of a relationship or maybe a string of really unhealthy relationships. And a lot of the reason that I have these clients is I get referrals from clients. So I will see a client and they'll refer a friend or a coworker or something like that who maybe has the same issue or similar issues. And so I have a lot of girls that I work with that are going through some major relationship issues where they have been in relationships with men who would be considered emotionally unavailable or emotionally unhealthy men, which also definitely means that they're unhealthy themselves and emotionally also. That's a whole nother subject. But I say this because there have been many times throughout sessions with the different young women that I'm working with where I have used little bits and pieces of my life or my relationship history to basically even the playing field. Sometimes it's simply just a shift in language of going, this is something you're dealing with, to this is something we have dealt with, so that they're understanding that they're not alone in this struggle. Other times I might feel freedom to share, given the circumstance or the person that I'm with, a specific relationship story where I might have experienced something very similar to what they're experiencing. Or I might share with them how tough it is to let go of a relationship that even though you might cognitively know is not a healthy one, it's definitely a difficult emotional process to get through it. And so the reason I might share that again then is to level the playing field, to let them know this is that I have in no way some upper hand of the how-tos of relationships, but rather that I can identify with them. I can understand where they're at, maybe what they're feeling and those sorts of things. So that's the way that I've used self-disclosure in a very positive way. Now, I will say that there are times where I have used stories of myself without the client actually knowing that it was me. So I might actually frame it in a way where I would say there was a client that I used to work with who, and then share the story. And the reason I sometimes do that is perhaps I feel like the client might overstep boundaries if I were to actually disclose that was me, or that they really would try to shift the direction, or that they might start to view me more as a friend and as a peer rather than as a client-therapist relationship. So I'm very aware of how I feel the client views me in our relationship, and that's how I kind of tailor that self-disclosure. So that would be a healthy way of self-disclosure. Self-disclosure gone bad, and I'm just going to be really honest. This is the worst thing that's ever happened to me in the counseling world. And when I used the self-disclosure, it was not at all with any intent to have it backfire on me the way that it did. So I'm just going to set up the situation for you a little bit. As most of y'all know, I worked for a community mental health agency doing in-home family services. And so part of my job, well actually the majority of my job, was that I would go to families' homes 3 times a week in their homes and do counseling. The primary client was the teenager in the home, but I worked a lot with the parents to work on parenting plans and how to discipline, how to communicate, how to build respect, a safe environment, all of those sorts of things. So as you can imagine, I was put in some very dangerous situations. Being in people's homes is not always safe. I have many, many stories that I could share. And if y'all take my my crisis counseling class in marriage and family therapy, you'll hear me talk a little bit more about some of my traumatic experiences working at that company. But with this particular story, this was a family that I was working with. I thoroughly enjoyed working with the daughter, and I feel very confident in saying that mom could have been diagnosed with some severe mental health issues, and she was just was one of the most devastating cases I've ever come across, just given the nature of how mom was. But in this particular circumstance, she claimed to be a believer, and I definitely didn't hide my faith, but it also wasn't something that I advertised either. And I have several tattoos on my body. All of them have very specific meanings. They're written in different languages with different words. There's a reason for why they are the places that they are, why they're in the language that they are, all of those sorts of things. And so I have a tattoo on my forearm. And it's two different Greek words. One of them is one that I don't share with anybody. And the other word is the Greek word for Holy Spirit, as it is pertaining to Holy Spirit meaning counselor or advocate, which of course I'm sure y'all can understand why that would be an important word to me. And so I was at her house one day, and she saw my tattoo. Course, I wasn't trying to hide it. She saw my tattoo and she asked what it meant. And so I just shared with her that it was the word for Holy Spirit as it pertained to counselor or advocate. And that was the end of the discussion. Well, this mother was one of the reasons that I actually quit my job, because several weeks later, she became highly erratic. She was very verbally abusive to me. I was locked in her house several times. Her house locked from the inside, and you couldn't get out unless you have the key, which I realize is illegal, but I couldn't do anything about that. And so she would trap me in her house and verbally berate me and just talk about her frustration and everything. And she was in a lot of trouble, but I was trapped inside the house. And at one point during one of these tirades that would last several hours, and I'm not exaggerating at all, she came back at me and said, and just went off on my tattoo and why I would have a tattoo that says counselor and advocate, because if I was truly a Christian, I would help her more. I would be able to do more for her. I was definitely not sharing and showing God's love, and this was just a reflection that I was a hypocrite and this whole thing was a hoax. I eventually got out of that situation, got off of that case, and ended up quitting my job, to make a long story short. But as you can guess, that is definitely an example of self-disclosure gone horribly wrong. Again, of course, I did not know that she would turn around and use that information against me. But one thing I do know about that particular client that I kind of carried with me is that it's okay to kind of gauge your client and use your gut instinct to go, do I actually share or feel comfortable sharing this part of myself? And reflecting back, I just should not have shared that because she was not a safe person to share those sorts of things with. So, self-disclosure gone horribly wrong. And I don't say that to scare you. You'll probably have y'all's own experiences with that. But I just talk about that so you understand the differences of why we would disclose things about ourselves, what the purpose is, and how good or bad can kind of come out of that. So we'll pause the video there and we'll move on in just a minute.